Can you hear me in the boardroom? Mr. Chair, can you hear me? This is,
Yes,
this
sir,
is-
Commissioner Cardenas. Loud and clear.
I'm zooming from a new location, so I am not used to this. Hopefully this will work. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. It's Thursday, June 17th, 2021, and this is the meeting of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. Mr. Lincoln, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Baker?
Here.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Here.
Commissioner Wilson?
Here.
Commissioner Wood?
Here.
Chair Matich?
Here. So good morning, everyone. We'll proceed to our first item, and that is item number 1, public comment for items not on today's agenda. Do we have any telephone comment for items not on today's agenda? Hearing and seeing none, we'll proceed to item number 2, approval of the May 2021 Commission hearing minutes. Do any commissioners have edits or comments on the meeting minutes?
Move to approve?
I will second. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Wood?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. Now proceed to our enforcement consent calendar. That's items 3, 4, and 5. Do any commissioners have items they wish to pull from consent?
Just item number 3, please.
Item number 3. Any commissioners have any additional items to pull from consent? All right. Then let's go ahead and proceed with items 4 and 5 as the consent calendar. Ms. Brereton, anything you wish to talk to us about items 4 or 5?
Yes, on item number... Sorry. Yes, on item number 5, I would just like to point out that you may have noticed that the factors for 18361.5 look a little bit different than they have in other stipulations. That's because at the time that we negotiated this particular stipulation, the former version of that regulation was in effect. We have since revised that, and so there are a few stipulations that may be out there still. This one was delayed in bringing it to the commission because due to COVID, we have been allowing respondents a little extra time and flexibility in making payments for the penalty amount. And so that caused some delay for this to be brought before the commission so that shows why there's a discrepancy between the old version of the regulations and the new ones. But we have gone through this, and all of the factors from the new regulations are included here in this stipulation, so we have covered them, which is primarily why we changed some of the regulations previously, because we were including that information.
Great, thank you for that. Do Commissioner Wood?
I just have a simple question, which is why are counts 1 and 2 split in this one? I was very curious to see that because they seem very similar. And so I assume there's something that I'm missing. There's a reason they couldn't be combined.
We could, thank you very much for your question. Yes, we can combine counts. In this particular matter, in order to align with the comparable case that we were using, we chose to divide it up in this way because that's the way the comparable case was set up. So we wanted to make sure that we were handling this matter in a similar way to a similar case.
Any other commissioner questions or comments for Ms. Brereton? Hearing none, do we have any public comment on our enforcement consent calendar? And that's items 4 and 5. Hearing and seeing none, do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
I'll second. Oh, Commissioner Cardenas, you got the second. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker,
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas,
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wood,
Aye.
Chair Matich.
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right. We'll now return to item number 3. Ms. Brereton, if maybe you can have a few introductory remarks. I believe this is a matter that came before us previously. We provided some direction to staff to negotiate a higher penalty.
Yes, thank you. As you mentioned, this matter was brought before the commission in April of 2021. The penalty we recommended at that time was $25,000. The commission gave us direction to return with a higher penalty amount. So we took that direction and went back to the parties and negotiated a new settlement with a higher penalty, and we are now recommending a $40,000 penalty for this case.
Thank you. Do commissioners have questions?
Yes, and thank you for the update and that explanation, and definitely see the changes, and also do see the factors are different in this one. So I appreciate you pointing that out previously. My question is a bit of a follow-up. I think that I may have asked at the April meeting, and perhaps, you know, is it part of our process that, or the enforcement team's process, when you are undergoing a stipulation like this, if there are any fact patterns that match potential either misdemeanor or felony behavior, that is, is it in your discretion to refer that to a prosecutor's office for their own investigation, or are there any guidelines for us on when we would need to do that? I don't know that there are any here, and I think the answer when I asked that in April was we don't know, but a little bit of time has passed, so I'm curious what our process is for when we do that and if it's matched in this case.
Yeah, so we have a standard list of violations that we automatically refer to law enforcement agencies, and that's, you know, at the intake stage. That includes cash contributions, any kind of campaign contribution laundering issues, some sender identification issues, things of that nature that are considered egregious and can involve intent and potential criminal activity. So those are automatics that we do. If during our investigation we see issues that involve other types of activity that might be in the purview of a law enforcement agency, we will reach out to that applicable agency, whether it be the local DA or the Attorney General, and we find out from them, like, is this something that you would like to, for us to refer to you? Because sometimes, I mean, we're not criminal attorneys, we don't deal with the penal code, so we want to make sure that it's something that they would be interested in, and if they want us to work with them on it, because if there are potential violations of the Act, we are the experts there, and so we would, you know, potentially work with them on that as well. So it's not automatic as far as criminal activity, but if we notice something, we will certainly do some follow-up on it.
And was there anything in this instance, maybe where there was a principal officer that might have been kind of a shell principal officer, and it was really somebody else who was the controlling principal, that rose to that? Has that a determination you've already made?
In this particular case, the evidence that we found did not rise to the level where we referred this matter to law enforcement. However, I can't speak to whether that would actually be something that a law enforcement agency would be interested in. We have to keep in mind the evidence that's available, and obviously criminal action requires a much higher standard of proof than our administrative actions. So sometimes we don't reach out necessarily.
Thank you. I appreciate the background on just how we handle that generally, what's automatic and what's in discretion, and what happened here. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Any other commissioner questions on item number 3? All right, hearing none. Is there any public comment on item number 3? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have a motion?
I'll move it.
Move to approve. Second.
All right, Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Wood?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Right. Go ahead and proceed now to item number 6. This is a pre-notice default. Chief Brereton.
Yes, thank you again. We have been in some contact with this particular respondent, but it's been sporadic. So we would hope that we'll be able to gain compliance with the filing, which is a prerequisite to any settlement that we might reach with the parties. So if we have that, we may delay when we return the default, but if we don't, then you'll see it back in July.
Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and proceed now to item number 7. This is the first of our general items, and I'm very pleased today that we have Bob Stern, former FPPC General Counsel and expert on the origins and histories of the Political Reform Act, which of course is the main law that we administer, interpret, and enforce here at the agency. So good morning, Mr. Stern. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. It's a delight to be with you. My name is Bob Stern. I was the first general counsel of the FPPC for almost 9 years, from January of 1975 to September 1983. I then moved to Los Angeles to become general counsel and then president of the Center for Governmental Studies, a nonprofit public interest research organization. And working with the CGS founder, Mr. Tracy Weston, and many others, we wrote books and reports that became the basis for statewide campaign finance ballot initiatives and for the Los Angeles City's public financing and ethics law passed in 1990, which also set up the LA City Ethics Commission. So turning to the history of the Political Reform Act, Secretary of State Jerry Brown gave me the following assignment when he hired me as his office's election lawyer in 1972. He said, quote, "Write the best reform legislation that you can. Write 3 bills: campaign disclosure, conflicts of interest, and lobbying disclosure." He added, "Don't worry about the legislature passing what you draft. The legislators will never vote for extensive reform because it is not in their best interests." This conversation occurred in my first encounter with Jerry Brown in the fall of 1972 at a restaurant called Posey's, a restaurant where the movers and shakers of Sacramento often dined. Before Brown hired me, I had been the committee consultant for 2 years at the legislature's Assembly Elections and Reapportionment Committee, chaired by Henry Waxman. A few months after I started working with the Secretary of State's office, Brown asked me to look at the lobbyist reports, which were published in hardcover books by the Legislative Committee, which received all reports of the lobbyists. I couldn't believe what I found printed in the books. Several lobbyists had apparently submitted statements that had lines redacted in the section reporting legislative gifts. I called the lobbyists and asked why they had blacked out those lines. They replied, "Our copies don't have anything blacked out." They itemized the gifts made to various legislators with the legislators' names, the amount of the gifts, what the gifts were for, usually dinners at Sacramento restaurants. It was clear that legislative staff members were inking out any part of a report that listed a gift to a legislator so that the public couldn't see them. So when I showed Brown the blackened pages, he immediately stated, "Let's hold a press conference," showing why lobbying reports need to be filed with the Secretary of State's office and not with the legislature. He enlarged the pages to 3 by 4 feet so cameras could easily show what had been redacted compared to what had actually been submitted originally by the lobbyists. Brown was right about the legislature. They quickly killed all 3 reform bills that I drafted early in 1973. A few months later, however, a group called the People's Lobby asked me to review a reform initiative that they planned to submit to the Attorney General in a week. After looking at the draft, I called them a few days later and said, Why are you requiring California campaign disclosure statements to be filed in Olympia, Washington? Sheepishly, they admitted that they had copied an initiative that had been passed by the voters in the state of Washington. I also observed that a number of other provisions in their proposal would be unconstitutional in California and showed them our bills that had been killed by the legislature. After a few days, they said, put the 3 bills together into one proposal and we will submit them to the Attorney General's office. At the same time, another group, California Common Cause, also indicated that they wanted to circulate a reform measure. However, it did not want to work with the People's Lobby in a joint effort. Thanks to Dan Lowenstein, Deputy Secretary of State, and to a lesser extent, Jerry Brown, the groups reluctantly agreed to work together on a single initiative. Dan Lowenstein and I combined the 3 failed reform bills into an initiative to be placed on the 1974 ballot. Dan was an expert wordsmith and drafted most of the act with my input along with Common Cause, Stanford law professor Bob Gerard, who had been my elections law professor when I was at Stanford, and many other reformers. After we finished our draft, Jerry Brown called us into his office and said, let me read what you've written. He went over the 18,000 words, asking why a particular comma or phrase was used, as well as giving many substantive comments. When the draft was finished, Common Cause and the People's Lobby raced each other to the Attorney General's office in an attempt to be the only official proponent. People's Lobby won that race. The measure began to be circulated in the summer of 1973 by the People's Lobby and California Common Cause, but Common Cause announced it would stop supporting the measure if the legislature passed 3 bills covered by the initiative. Assemblyman Henry Waxman, my boss before Brown, asked me to help him work on his campaign disclosure bill to stop the initiative. The legislature particularly did not like the part establishing a commission to administer and enforce the law. And the legislature passed his campaign disclosure bill, which was approved by Common Cause. The bill, the Waxman-Dimely Campaign Disclosure Act, provided excellent campaign disclosure and went into effect in 1974. Senator George Moscone, later the mayor of San Francisco, introduced a conflicts of interest bill similar to what was in the initiative. However, on the floor of the Senate, a senator successfully offered an amendment to change one word, shall, to may. The bill as passed thus read that state and local agencies may require their appointed officials to file statements of economic interest. Common Cause announced the bill was acceptable since it still mandated disclosure and disqualification by elected officials. On the last day of the 1973 legislative session, I was in the state Senate's gallery watching the senators debate the 3rd bill that needed to be passed if Common Cause was to stop supporting the initiative. The bill dealt with lobbying disclosure. During the debate, one of the veteran senators rose and said, you know who has more influence over the legislature than the lobbyists? It's the press corps. I move we require the Sacramento press corps to file lobbying disclosure statements. Amazingly, the amendment passed 19-16, and the lobbying bill as amended was sent back to the Assembly for concurrence. The Assembly refused to pass the amended bill, and Common Cause and the People's Lobby continued to circulate the initiative, which qualified for the June 1974 ballot. Each group gathered about half the signatures necessary to qualify the initiative, so it took both of them for the measure to get on the ballot. On the night of June 1974, when the voters approved Proposition 9, the Political Reform Act of 1974, by a 70% to 30% margin, I asked Dan Lowenstein if this would be the highlight of my professional career at the age of 30. He shrugged and said he didn't know, but this turned out to be the highlight of my professional career. The act was recently called one of the 12 most important election results in California history by the book Game Changers. Let me go give you some innovations in the Political Reform Act. The amendments. Proposition 9 was not the first, but one of the first initiatives to allow the legislature to amend its provisions. The California Constitution says no initiative may be amended without a vote of the people unless the initiative permits the legislature to change its provisions. As you know, the Political Reform Act says amendments must further the purposes of the measure, must receive at least 2/3 vote in the legislature and must be in print for at least 10 days before final passage of each house. We knew that this complex act was not perfect, would need to change as circumstances warranted, and the legislature has amended the act, I think, at least 200 times, and almost all the amendments have been good additions to the act. Secondly, appropriations. Proposition 9 guaranteed legislative appropriations of $1 million plus cost of living increases to the Fair Political Practices Commission. So why was that? Well, after the state of Washington passed its reform initiative in 1972, the state legislature refused to appropriate any money for its commission, and it took months before it could become operational. So we learned from Washington, and this may have been the first initiative ever to require the legislature to appropriate money to an executive agency every year. 3, appointment of commissioners. If all the constitutional officers who make appointments to the commission are all in one party, as is the case today with Democrats holding all the statewide offices, the state controller must pick from a list submitted by the chair of the other party. So that's why there's a Republican appointee by the Democratic controller today. And also, of course, there's no legislative confirmation of commissioners. 4, term limits. All FPPC commissioners are limited to 1 full term. We did not want commissioners catering to their appointing power in order to be reappointed. 5, effective date. The act went into effect on January 7th, 1975. Now, why was that? California Constitution says that initiatives go into effect the day after the election unless the initiative specifies otherwise. We knew it would take a while to get the commission started, so we delayed the effective date, but not to January 1st, but rather January 7th. The reason, the governor appoints the full-time chair and another member. If the act had gone into effect January 1st, Governor Ronald Reagan would have made those appointments. So we waited till the day after he left office. Now, in July of '73, we didn't know that Jerry Brown would be elected governor, but we did know that Reagan would not be governor. And this is a footnote, by the way. Jerry Brown narrowly won the election in November of 1974, and he beat State Controller Houston Flournoy, who happened to be a professor of mine at Pomona College. And I would see him after class and talk about Sacramento. He would have made good appointments also. I don't think I would have become general counsel, however. Now, mistakes. We were not perfect. We wrote some provisions I would change today. First, I would change the $10 lobbyist gift limit. It should have said no gifts at all. But we were concerned that a cup of coffee provided by a lobbyist to a public official would be a violation. So we put it in a monetary amount. The $10 lobbyist gift limit was dubbed by Jerry Brown as enough for 2 hamburgers and a Coke. You know, if you go to McDonald's today, this still holds true. You can still get 2 hamburgers and a Coke from McDonald's for $10 or less. It would have been much easier, however, just to ban the gifts, since we soon found out that lobbyists were providing gifts up to the limit or even combining the $10 limit with other lobbyists. 2, dividing enforcement responsibilities among different agencies. So the Secretary of State receives the campaign statements, the Franchise Tax Board audits lobbying and campaign statements, and the AG and district attorneys bring criminal actions. I would have the FPPC receive all the campaign and lobbying statements and audit those statements rather than have the other agencies involved. And then 3, if someone is criminally found to be in violation of the act, I would require they serve at least 1 day and 1 night in jail. I think that would be a major deterrent to deliberate violations. Now, just a footnote. When we started in January of 1975, the commission met several times a month. I remember meeting at least twice a week for a few months. Dan Lowenstein thinks it might even be more often than that. In any event, we were writing regulations at the meetings. It was pretty chaotic. And when we weren't meeting publicly, lobbyists in particular were deluging our office with advice requests. We only started with a staff of 5 people, by the way, at the beginning, and we had lots of requests coming in. In conclusion, I'm amazed the act has lasted 46 years. I thought it would be ineffective within 10 years as the legislature and the lobbyists got around its provisions. But the legislative amendment process and you, the commission, have kept it viable and still important to the people of California. So my hat is off to you and previous commissions. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Stern. Appreciate that history. Let's start with the commissioners. Do commissioners have any questions for Mr. Stern? Commissioner Wood.
Hi, it's so good to see you again. You talked about mistakes that you think were put into the act. I'm wondering what amendments you would make now. Is it you would just fix those mistakes, or are there additional things that you think we should do, like particularly in light of the way campaigning has changed over the past 4 decades?
Yeah, of course, we made some, I mean, actually the mistakes were not really drafting mistakes. Dan Lowenstein was so good that I think that there really weren't that many drafting, but there were substantive mistakes that I would change today. And remember, the most advanced technology we had in the 70s was an IBM Selectric typewriter. If you wanted to look at campaign statements, you had to come to Sacramento or Los Angeles and go through all the paper copies. And so the biggest change, of course, has been the computerization. And I think the big change there is the fact that you have major contributors that are listed on the ads, which I think is a much, much better way of getting it across to the voters. I think the big, I guess, the concern I have is that the public was not that upset by the campaign disclosures. I thought within a couple of years of this intense disclosure, we would have public financing of campaigns. And there was a bill in 1976 that almost passed the legislature. The other big problem, of course, today, in my view, is the United States Supreme Court decisions, and not Citizens United, but Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976 was, I think, the biggest problem. And it basically said no expenditure limits, no mandatory public financing, and opened the door, I think, for a lot of abuses today. So I blame the Supreme Court for sort of cutting back on what the act could have accomplished. But again, it still has accomplished a lot since 75.
Great, thank you. Do we have any, our executive staff, anyone have questions or comments for Mr. Stern? Oh, Commissioner Baker, and then Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you. Again, thank you for the history. It was very interesting to hear, and also thank you for having it so it can be amended by the legislature. That's one of the real difficulties of our very robust initiative system in California, is when there are initiatives that pass, there's no way to change it other than another amendment to the Constitution. So thank you for being prescient in that one. I'm curious, looking at in 2 questions. One is if there's anything in the area of statement of economic interest and the disclosures that are made there that, I mean, you've been asked already if you might change, but I want to sort of double check in that area if there's any. And the second goes to we've been undertaking the streamlining process to not only increase how quickly we're able to resolve enforcement matters, but try to distinguish between those who are doing their best in a complicated compliance world and those who maybe really have bad actions in mind and have bad conduct in mind. I wonder if there's anything in the act that you might further change in that regard to appropriately make that distinction and give folks a chance to comply, similar to what we've been trying to do with streamlining. So those are my 2 that I'm really curious about from you.
Yeah, thank you. Very excellent questions. By the way, most initiatives that amend the statutes as opposed to the Constitution do allow themselves to be amended. I think almost every initiative that I've seen since the Political Reform Act has amending process. The problem is there are many initiatives that amend the Constitution. And if you amend the Constitution, you have to go back to the people. So my recommendation would be don't amend the Constitution so much, amend the laws, and so that the legislature can come in and successfully amend those. And there have been challenges, I don't think to the Political Reform Act, but to some initiatives where the legislature overreached and some of the amendments were actually tossed out by the courts. Secondly, in statement of economic interest, yeah, really interesting question. I got lots of criticism, well, we got lots of criticism by the press for saying you never showed how much a legislator was worth. And I said that wasn't the purpose of the conflicts of interest. The purpose was to show, was there a conflict of interest? And as you can see, and you people know this, but you don't have to disclose bank accounts, you don't have to disclose mutual funds, you don't have to disclose a lot of things that could not be affected by your decisions as public officials. However, in looking back on it, I wonder whether or not there should be some sort of a net worth statement so we can see if legislators, or more importantly, public officials who are appointed officials, benefited from their time in office, if their net worth went up dramatically. Now, obviously, everybody's net worth has gone up in the last couple of years if you own stocks, because the stock market has done very well. But if somebody's net worth went up dramatically, and particularly appointed officials as opposed to legislative officials, because as you know, legislative officials have term limits, and so you're out within 12 years. Appointed officials could go on for a long time and are not really followed that carefully. So that would be something I might want to take a look at, is sort of a net worth statement. I don't like the idea of having to list all the assets and how much they're worth specifically, because I think that's just too much trouble. I like the ranges that are in the act. Maybe the ranges should be broadened a little bit, but I like the fact that there are ranges as opposed to exact amounts. Thirdly, in terms of, should I stop there? Do you have any questions about that? I can go on to enforcement.
I don't. I'm appreciating your input. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of enforcement, I mean, when we first came in, we had a very limited staff, obviously. And Dan Lowenstein, who is chairman of the commission, said, I want us to focus on major cases and not worry about the small cases. And so we did. It took a lot of resources, and we were successful sometimes and unsuccessful many times, because people would, I remember one legislator defied our subpoenas and refused to cooperate with us. And finally, we issued a report a week before his reelection, and he lost his reelection. And he said, you know, that's because you filed it a week before the election. We said, if you had cooperated with us, we would have filed something or settled the case a year earlier, but he refused to cooperate. And I also remember one case where a group filed an enforcement case with us and had a huge press conference, and they made the front page of the San Francisco paper saying, group charges violations of the Political Reform Act. When we looked at the complaint, there was nothing to it. And so I quickly issued a press release within a few days saying there is nothing to this complaint. And that made the front page of the papers as well. And the group was furious with me, saying, why did you do that before the election? I said, because you were using us in your campaign, and there was nothing to it. But I think your enforcement division has done a terrific job of trying to winnow down and trying to make sure that the minor violations are taken care of speedily. I mean, you don't want people who make mistakes to have to hire attorneys, although sometimes they probably have to deal with the commission. You want the commission to be able to settle these things quickly. The important thing is to get amendments in, particularly amendments before the election. And also, you know, I would be focusing on money laundering, on again, the cash contributions, on serious violations, because those are what the public is concerned about, not somebody who makes a mistake occasionally. And I know you're not bringing enforcement actions if somebody just makes, you know, one or two mistakes. It's obviously they have to do more than that. So I'm very impressed with your enforcement division. I have been impressed all along. You've brought some very major cases in the past, and you've cooperated. I would urge also that you cooperate more with the local ethics agencies, particularly LA Ethics. You did in one case in the 90s, where it resulted in a $950,000 fine that was paid by the respondents. And the other question, I guess, is whether or not a fine is enough to deter violations. I remember one case where we fined a legislator, and then about 6 months later, we fined him again. And we said, well, why did you commit the violation again? He said, because it didn't matter. My constituents don't care if I pay you the fines. I guess in that case, I would have liked to have, you know, brought a criminal action. And again, my one day and one night in jail idea, I've been toying with the idea the FPPC should have criminal authority, because clearly DAs and prosecutors don't have the resources or the will to bring a lot of white collar crimes, and you guys have the expertise to do so. So it's very controversial to give you criminal authority, but it's something I've been thinking about. But again, I think if you were faced with a day in jail or a night in jail, that would deter a lot of us who would just not want to go to jail for any period of time.
Right, Commissioner Wilson?
Well, Mr. Stern, thank you for your presentation. This is Dobson Wilson. The question I had was pretty much answered in your last response, but I just want to say that when I first started working in the legislature in the late 70s, you were a legend then, and you remain a legend in this field. So thank you for all of your hard work, your dedication, and for setting a standard that all of us involved in government, both at the state and local level, should adhere to. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I've long admired your career as well. And I was delighted that you were appointed to the commission. So thank you particularly for those kind words. I appreciate that.
And I didn't need one day and one night in jail to adhere to that standard. So thank you.
That's right.
Well, I had a question for you, Mr. Stern. So in light of the complexity of the rules that you and Mr. Lowenstein were crafting for us to regulate this space, I mean, at the time you were doing this, did you foresee essentially spawning this whole cottage industry of campaign finance, lawyers, and compliance experts, and getting to a point where, I mean, even if you want to run for school board, it seems like oftentimes you're almost in a position where you have to hire a lawyer now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I remember we had some seminars for lobbyists, and it was so popular, we had to have 2 of them at the convention center, and I think there were like 300 people at both these events. And I was just amazed. And I made a comment that I really regret making today because it got a lot of laughter, and I think they were right. And I said, you know, I fill out my tax returns, and this is no different than filling out tax returns. Well, of course, I guess, I mean, and my tax returns sometimes were complicated. I remember one time my wife was on a different fiscal year and we were doing income averaging. So it was pretty complicated, but that was the wrong comment to make because most people obviously rely on accountants to do their tax returns. And I guess I anticipated, yes, there would be in a lot of cases having to have lawyers and accountants, but campaigns have become much more complicated. If you have a simple campaign, you don't need a lawyer or an accountant, but nobody has a simple campaign today, particularly today when you're seeing lots of recall elections and you're seeing lots of controversy at school board elections. People are raising lots and lots of money. And when you raise lots and lots of money, then you have the money to provide, you know, to ask for an accountant or a lawyer to help you out. I hope it's only accountants at this point and, you know, doing the books. You know, when we first started, I remember people were saying, well, my spouse does my books. And I was saying, oh, you know, and these were talking about $25,000, $30,000 campaigns. And I was saying, you know, probably you should have at least an accountant take a look at it as opposed to your spouse doing the books. And then I also remember when computers started coming in, people were saying, oh, we don't want to use a computer. We don't want to be required to file electronically. And there was a big resistance to filing electronically because some of the older legislators and older officials were saying, we don't have computers, we don't know how to use them. And of course, my comment was, well, just talk to your son or daughter and they'll help you out. And that's what I do all the time is talk to my son and it helps me out with the computer. So, you know, circumstances obviously have changed dramatically since the 1970s with computers. And I think actually have made it not only easier, you don't have to have the file cards anymore and look through and see, did this person give $50 last month or $100 2 months ago? You have it on the computer and you have programs that help you out. So I think the computers have actually made it somewhat easier. But at the same time, because campaigns have become more complicated and more expensive, you obviously need to have some assistance. So I hope that helps answer the question a little bit.
No, it certainly does. You know, we have our education outreach unit that tries to help folks understand those rules to the extent that they need assistance there. So appreciate your comments. Any other comments from commissioners for Mr. Stern while we have him?
Mr. Chair, if I might.
Please, Commissioner Cardenas.
Mr. Stern, thank you very much for joining us today. Very much admired, even before the privilege I've had of serving in this commission, very much admired your work over the years. My question, sir, you referenced earlier an opportunity perhaps for the FPPC to work more closely with the Los Angeles City Ethics Commission. I happen to live in Los Angeles County, and as we both know, as I think we all know, there's no shortage of untoward behavior discerned and that which is perhaps never sees the light of day, or at least is never investigated down here in Los Angeles County. Mr. Stern, what do you think a more robust, appropriate, and responsive level of cooperation between the FPPC and LA City Ethics, as an example, what might that look like?
First of all, of course, LA County does not have an ethics commission, and that's a shame. And I think LA County really needs to have something like LA City. LA City's ethics commission is robust. They have good staff. I would just hope that you would have maybe monthly or quarterly meetings with them. And maybe, I don't know whether you do this or not, because I don't follow that as carefully, but maybe you should have San Francisco. By the way, San Francisco Ethics Commission has, as executive director, she was executive director of the LA Ethics Commission, so she really knows both. But have San Francisco and Oakland and San Diego and LA, have a Zoom meeting with them every couple of months and see what's happening at those in those commissions and in those areas, and see if you can help. I mean, you are the big group. I mean, you have much more resources. LA City has a lot of resources. San Francisco has some resources, but you have the major resources, and they can help you, and I think you could help them in dealing with local problems. LA City's had a lot of problems. They've been basically criminal problems, and so LA Ethics Commission has not been involved as much. But I think just having meetings with them, talking to their staffs on a regular basis, and maybe having a meeting with all the Ethics Commission, particularly now that we have Zoom, it's so much easier. In the past, I'd said you should get together in Fresno and work together in Fresno, but with Zoom, you can really do this pretty easily and see what their problems are and see how you can help. You helped in the 1990s. You and the LA Ethics Commission had a major investigation together, resulting in this $950,000 fine, half to the state, half to the city. That was really a landmark, and that would be something that you should duplicate. Of course, my hope is that there's no enforcement. I mean, I would just as soon have no enforcement at all, in the sense that everybody is complying with the law. That is my goal, is not to put people in jail, not to fine people, but to have people complying. And so that is the most important function, obviously, but your enforcement function acts as a deterrent to make sure, because as we said when we were writing, we knew about 5% of public officials don't really care about the laws and may violate the law, but 95% of people want to comply with the laws, want to obey the laws, and all they need is some guidance and some assistance in doing so, and they will do it. It's the 5% obviously you have to worry about, and in some cases, those 5% you're going to have to be criminal actions taken against them. So again, working closely with the local officials, maybe working closely with the DAs as well if they need help, but just to be out there offering, because you have lots of resources and lots of talent at your commission that you could share.
Mr. Stern, sounds like a great idea. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. So at this time, let's go ahead and open it up to public comment on Mr. Stern's presentation. This is item number 7 on our agenda. Do we have any public comment? Hearing and seeing none. Mr. Stern, excuse me, Executive Director West.
Hello, not exactly public, but I just wanted to say something. I'm happy to report that we do actually work really closely with the local ethics agencies, and during my time as enforcement chief, worked with them on multiple cases and had a lot of contact, and they call us when they want to make sure that we're on the same page. We used to have quarterly meetings before COVID. We're going to go back to that with all the different ethics agencies. We had a big annual gathering a couple of years ago where everybody sat around round tables and we did little groups and talked about the issues that we see in our jurisdictions. So we do a lot of outreach to the different ethics agencies and have really good working relationships with them. So just want to let everybody know that I totally agree that that's the way for strength in California to enforce the rules.
And I guess one other point I would make is there's something called the Council on Governmental Ethics Laws, and I know the chair has been, several of the staff members have been. Dan Lowenstein actually helped start that before it was COGL in 1974. They started having conferences in 1975, and now 400 people, well, before last year, 400 people would come to conferences from all over the country and also in Canada. And where the commission can be the most help is that you guys, again, you have so much more expertise and talent than most of the other agencies have, which have very small staffs generally. So to be on panel discussions, and you have been, to help these other agencies, and then to learn from these other agencies. I mean, they obviously can teach you some things too. So there's an annual conference every year, and I hope that you'll send the chair and maybe the commissioner and some staff members to that conference. I think it's going to be in Denver in December, and I go every year as well, and find that there's just some excellent people working on these issues throughout the country. You can learn from them, but more importantly, they will learn from you.
Yes, I completely agree. In fact, I think you were actually in my brain, because we're planning to go to COGL, and the general counsel, the chair, and I are all going to appear on panels. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say the secrets of what's planning for COGL, but what we're hoping to do is a panel on interaction between local and state ethics agencies and how they work together. So it's all very segued into exactly what you said. So yes, it's a wonderful organization, and we're happy to be a part of it.
All right. Well, again, Mr. Stern, thank you so much for being here today, sharing your perspective on the Act. Thank you for writing the Act, by the way, so that we're all here today. So again, sir, I hope you'll come join us again at some point in the future, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your questions and comments, and I wish you the best of luck.
All right, you too. Take care. All right, we'll now proceed to item number 8. This is our pre-notice discussion of amendments to Regulation 18421.5 regarding reporting of expenditures for paid online communications, et cetera. And we have Commission Counsel Mr. Lewis with us. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Just one moment, I'll get set up here. It's nice to see everybody in person. Let's see. All right, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation. So I'm Torrin Lewis, as mentioned, Commission Counsel with the Legal Division. I'm going to be speaking to you today about some proposed regulatory changes around the advertising disclosure rules, as well as other paid online communications. Before we begin, just to give you a brief overview, I'm going to recap where we left off on this matter, provide some background that I hope will be helpful to the Commission for this discussion regarding the online campaign landscape and technologies, and also the legal framework that exists to address issues in that landscape. Then we'll turn to the actual proposals themselves, and both after that and throughout, happy to answer any questions that you might have. So as mentioned, to recap, this matter was before the Commission last at its April 15th meeting, at which point we presented some general outlines, I suppose you could say, of the proposed changes without actual reg text. And at the instruction of the Commission, went back and actually drafted language that's before you today, which we subsequently presented at the Law and Policy meeting to Chair Matich and Commissioner Baker. And so we're back here today with pre-notice discussion of the proposed regulatory changes. Before we dive into those, some quick background about what we'll be speaking about. So, as mentioned in some previous presentations, the online campaign landscape has evolved significantly, I think, as we've all experienced the last, I'd say probably 2 decades, but really in the last decade, there's been quite a change. We've seen a huge explosion in paid advertisements on social media platforms. So those are ads where a committee will actually pay the platform for a sponsored ad, much like the other types of sponsored ads we see outside of the campaign space. But there's also been a convergence of blogging and social media and other types of electronic media. And this is quite important for what we'll be talking about in the context of amending the so-called blogger regulation, 18421.5. So I can get into that a little more later. The third thing to touch upon is really this rise in paid social media influencers. I think we're all probably familiar with the practice, but individuals with large followings on social media platforms who are paid for their content regarding a certain campaign or committee. And finally, one thing that's also been in the news is an emergence of so-called community journalism, and then less positively fake news sites. So there's really a change in the perception to the public of what may or may not be news, with, for example, outlets being paid to write content on behalf of a committee or candidate as an article. And so just to put a finer point on this, is pictured here, you might be able to see, I'm not sure if the images are too small, the practice of paying influencers, we're not only talking about people with national level followings, but perhaps even more importantly, individuals who have very strong followings and a lot of influence at the local level. And we've seen a lot of reporting around campaigns paying people to publish content in support of candidates at the local level as well, which I think is quite relevant for our purposes. A related issue first raised by Commissioner Wood at the April Commission meeting, and then Mr. Chair, you and Commissioner Wood asked us to come back and draft some language around this, is this practice of amplification. And so what we're talking about when we say amplification is really measures that are designed to increase either the audience size of an online communication or create the appearance of support or opposition for a candidate or measure, whether or not that appearance is factually accurate. And so I have a picture here from an article about this featuring so-called bots, which are automated programs pictured here as robots hitting the like button. So one example of that practice is a campaign can actually pay for bots, these automated programs, that will then automatically, for example, retweet a candidate's message versus that happening organically, so to speak. Another example is, I'll go to the next slide quickly. There are sites that actually advertise retweets, likes, and follows on social media for sale. And they do this very explicitly. You know, this particular site pictured here, I don't know how accurate or effective this service is, but they very clearly advertise this is something one can do. Jumping back for a minute, so under the current law, under the Act and regulations, if a candidate or committee were to pay for such a service, the only thing that's really required of them is to report that as an expenditure. And so pictured here, if they paid a firm for this, they could use the code CNS for campaign consultants on their Form 460, Schedule E, and they could just say, they paid for digital strategy as opposed to 5,000 likes or what have you. So it's kind of a disconnect about as to what's happening and what the public is seeing in this context. Just a brief overview on this slide here is to illustrate that the proposed changes before you today are really dealing with two different issues in the law. One is expenditure reporting, and so when we're talking about amending the so-called blogger regulation, that is an issue of making changes to the expenditure reporting requirements for committees that fall under that regulation. And separately, we're talking about the advertising disclosure rules contained in the Act and relevant regulations and making changes to the advertising disclosure rules, or really clarifications in some cases, and then proposing a new regulation dealing with the advertising disclosure rules. So starting with the first regulation we're going to be discussing, Regulation 18421.5. This is often referred to as the blogger regulation, and that moniker comes from the fact that when it was adopted in 2013, it was adopted in response to concerns that bloggers in particular, political bloggers, were being paid by committees or candidates to write posts or articles without actually disclosing that paid relationship to the public. And so what this regulation did was require that when a committee pays someone to write not just a blog post, but other online content on the committee's behalf, the committee has to report the details of that expenditure on the committee's campaign statements using the code WEB. So again, the blogger regulation was created to ensure that on the expenditure side of things, the committee was reporting the details of this transaction. The regulation didn't contemplate covering paid ads, for example, a committee directly paying, say, Facebook for a sponsored advertisement. And another exception under the regulation was that a committee could actually opt out of this disclosure, opt out of this expenditure reporting requirement by including a disclosure statement on the content itself. But to be clear, that disclosure statement is a unique requirement, or unique option, I should say, within this blogger reg. It's separate from the disclosure requirements of, for example, the Disclose Act or the other advertising disclosure rules in the Act. Some additional background on the blogger regulation, and so again, just to emphasize, the blogger nickname is a bit misleading. It's always applied to all paid online communications, whether they be blog posts, website posts, but also posts on social media, or they can be video posts. But the reason why we're talking about this today is that since it was adopted in 2013, the landscape of online communications has changed pretty significantly. And so there's been a shift away from separate, standalone, traditional blogging, if we can use that phrase, to integration of blogging and social media and all other types of electronic media. So for example, I've just pictured a couple kind of forerunners of political blogging, one being Huffington Post, which, started off as a sort of traditional blog, now has 11 million followers on Twitter, and Twitter, of course, is a place where many, many people go directly for their news nowadays. Similarly, Andrew Sullivan, who started off as a political blogger and really was a pioneer in that field, now, I think then became a writer for The Atlantic, then now has gone back, as many bloggers have done, to being to running a paid newsletter via Substack. So all this is to say, it's not clear anymore when we say blogging that we just mean someone publishing something using, WordPress or Blogger or Typepad. There's all different kinds of platforms, and the term is, I think, much broader. when it comes to advertising disclosure, something to note is that there's also a disconnect between the disclosure required on a candidate or committee's own social media post and those disclosures required if a committee pays a third party, such as a social media influencer, to post on their behalf. So here we have an example, which is just a mock-up that we've shown before, of a candidate who posts, he's running for city council, he posts, let's say, on Instagram. It's pretty clear to the public who is posting this, who paid for it, and in this case, it's also clear that under the Act, the ad paid for by disclosure and hyperlink is required on the candidate's profile or landing page, which is not that big of a problem in this case in terms of disclosure because it's clear to the public who's made this communication. By contrast, if that same candidate were to pay a social media influencer, say an Instagram influencer, to post on his behalf, it's not as clear to the public, or maybe not clear at all, who paid for the ad. In fact, it looks like this individual is just kind of organically posting her support on behalf of the candidate. One challenge is that the Act actually currently prohibits us from requiring disclosure directly on the influencer's page. And so it's only required on the landing page of the committee who paid this influencer. That being said, we've informally advised, legal division has informally advised that the post should be tagged with the committee's, or tagged so that viewers can click and link to the committee's landing page to find that information. And so that would be that tag there in the bottom corner. And so this is just the text in case you are interested of where that comes from. Finally, we're going to be proposing also some changes to the rules around disclosure on online videos. There's been some questions as to whether videos posted on social media that qualify as ads only require disclosure on the landing page, as stated in section 84504.3H of the Act, or whether the videos need to have disclosure on the video itself, which is required in a different section of the Act, 84504.3G, through reference to two other sections. So there's some questions there about what is required. Again, we have advised that advertisements in the form of videos, and sorry, I should be clear, when we're talking about videos, we mean videos posted to social media, I think has been the question. So we have advised that ads in the form of videos that fall under this section, regardless of where they appear, must comply with the on-ad video disclosure rules, and that would include videos posted to social media. So I'll pause here to see if anybody has any questions before discussing the actual substance of the proposals themselves.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Any questions, Commissioner Wilson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lewis, for your presentation. And when I think of the term blogger, I think of flip phones. So I appreciate the clarification. But what would be the monetary threshold that would trigger a reporting requirement?
An expenditure reporting requirement?
Yes.
That would be $100.
How much?
$100.
Okay. All right. I have another question, but I'll wait to ask that one.
Sure.
Any other questions, Commissioner Baker?
Just for clarification on the very last point you made regarding videos and what is existing rule and the informal advice, that the disclosure that's exemplified on the screen here appears throughout the video or just at the end of the video? What is the advice that we've been giving to folks?
Let's see, let me just pause for a moment. Let's see.
I feel like this was covered in April, so I'm having a memory. Recollection is helpful.
Yeah, sorry, I have to reference the the text real quick to be able to tell you. So if I'm reading correctly, actually, I don't recall off the top of my head. Do you happen to know or refer to? Here we are. Thank you. So I believe the appropriate rule would be A4504.1B. And the disclosure shall be written and displayed for at least 5 seconds of a broadcast of 30 seconds or less, or for at least 10 seconds of a broadcast that lasts longer than 30 seconds.
Thank you. So there is specific guidance, and I'm sure that our advice that we're giving to folks informally is consistent with that, so, okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any more questions for Mr. Lewis before he continues his presentation? Go ahead, Mr. Lewis.
Okay, so looking at the actual substance of the proposals themselves, the first are a set of proposed amendments to Regulation 18421.5. Again, this is the so-called blogger regulation that, of course, applies to more things than just blogs. And the first proposed change would be to update the regulation, put differently, maybe modernize some of the language to better address the expansion of platforms on which this kind of paid content more frequently appears. So this would be digital applications and so forth. The second proposed change deals with expanding the expenditure reporting requirements to include more specific information about these paid online communications. So to give you an example, pictured here is an influencer on Instagram who has actually a dog. And let's say that a candidate were to pay GIF-POM, as the dog is known, for an Instagram post referencing the candidate's campaign. The information required would now be expanded to include GIF-POM, the highlighted portion here, that it's an Instagram post by GIF-POM, including GIF-POM's handle or public username, and also the URL, and this would be required for each platform on which this occurs. So if the committee then pays GIF-POM to do the same thing on Facebook, we would require the URL again, rather than only in the first instance, which was the existing rule. The other relevant change here on this slide is that we would clarify the disclosure requirements to specify that where communication covered by this reg also meets the definition of an advertisement, the advertising disclosure rules would apply as well. So it's not an either-or proposition.
That's a quick question on that one.
Sure.
Please. So would that would appear on the, by the way, I compliment you on the exemplars that you were coming up with. They're lots of fun. But that would appear on the actual part where the picture of the dog is. That's where the disclosure would be, not on the paper filing or the filing. Is that what you're referring to? When you say that it's also treated like an advertisement, you're demonstrating that on the post here, whatever it is, maybe this is on Instagram, that will also be treated like an advertisement. Okay.
That's right, yeah. So where a committee pays a third party to, in effect, in that case, act as a, to create an advertisement for them, that advertisement would still need to comply with the advertising disclosure rules, including on-ad disclosure if it meets the criteria. So another change we are proposing, and that's been discussed previously, is the changes regarding or with respect to amplification. And so subsection D of the proposed regulation would require details to be reported in connection with payments for amplification. And so that would include the name of the payee, the name of the individual providing the content, and the name of the URL or website where it's being published. And so, for example, pictured here is Schedule E of Form 460. Let's say, going back to that previous example, we talked about that where a committee pays a consultancy for amplification services, rather than simply entering the code CNS for campaign consultants and writing digital strategy or whatever they please, they would need to provide more specific details such as 10,000 retweets, 10,000 likes. And so that would shed a little more light on what that transaction is for the public. Any questions about 18421.5 before we move on?
Yeah, why don't we take commissioner comments on point 5 first, and then we can move on to the next one. So I know we talked about this a little bit at Law and Policy, but in 18421.5, we use some terms like web application, and I'm looking at paragraph A, perfect. Web application, digital application, and I mentioned at the time at Law and Policy that I thought if the Act doesn't currently contain definitions for those terms, that we ought to, as part of this reg, add definitions as well. So I wanted to just raise that again in the full commission meeting, just see if my colleagues agree that that would be a useful thing for staff to do. Mindful this is pre-notice, so we're going to be continuing to work on this.
I agree, and appreciated that you brought that up in Law and Policy. And again, now, what I've thought about since then on this particular point is that the terminology is going to change. I mean, we are writing this based on what today's, almost literally today's social media is. 2 months from now, there might not only be likes, there might be some other form of embrace that is there, and that these will, landing page may very quickly become obsolete. So the extent to which as you look at these definitions, it'll be very important to not only be as current as possible, but what we're already missing potentially, and to make it as clear as possible, because this is a very new disclosure for folks to have to do, and it could be aged by the time we get it out there. So thank you.
Mr. Bainbridge?
Dave Bainbridge, General Counsel. I just wanted to address that. We spent quite a bit of time talking about that and thinking about it. Our concern with defining these terms is that by defining them, we may miss things. I think these are pretty broad terms. And in our experience with giving advice, these are terms that are in the Act that we have given, that have been in existence for a couple of years now since the Disclose Act. We haven't had questions about what these terms mean. I think our hesitation with trying to define them is that we may inadvertently exclude things that should be included. So just for something for the commission to consider, if it's the direction that you want to define them, we'll try to write up terms that would work. But that was our thinking in drafting this and not defining them, is we may actually exclude things that we want to include. And we thought these terms were fairly well understood by the public.
Yeah, and that may have been a misunderstanding on my part, because I thought that the terms digital application, web application were not already defined in the Act. And so if they are, and we've already provided advice, that wasn't my understanding when I made the suggestion.
No, I'm not saying they're not defined, but they're just used in the Act, in the Disclose Act. And what I was saying is we haven't so far experienced people having trouble understanding what these terms mean.
Okay, Commissioner.
To play devil's advocate, how do we know that? I mean, I would defer to you in terms of, your expertise, but there are terms that are used in the Act that if a college student looked at the Act, they should be able to understand what that term means. And while, a term can be interpreted in a more narrow or broader way, I think you could write a definition that indicated that, that this is not an all-inclusive definition, but kind of a guidepost that allows people to see what does this actually mean. If you were to ask every citizen in California what landing page means, I mean, how many would understand it? And some may have different interpretations, but if you have a general definition with the understanding, that this is not an all-inclusive definition, I think it's helpful. But that's just my take on it.
All right. Let's come back to the definition of the technical terms in a second here, because I wanted to move to another point I raised in law and policy, and that's in paragraph E. We use the phrase paid advertisements. The word advertisements is used there, but it's not in quotes. It doesn't refer to a particular section of the Act. But then when I look at new paragraph I, we then refer to communication meets the definition, and there we use quotes and we cite a specific section. And I think for clarity, I think it is confusing, is my point, when we use the term advertisement in two different places and mean two different things, all within the same reg. And I think if in E, there's another term that you could use there, I would, or some clarifying language you could use there to distinguish what you mean there from what you mean by an advertisement in another portion of the regulation. I think that would be helpful. And just as a general matter, I think when we're doing regs, we ought to be cognizant of that. So those are the two things I wanted to point out with respect to the blogger regulation portion. With respect to amplification, we also had a conversation in law and policy about the amplification portion of this regulation. And I think Commissioner Baker raised the question, or I guess the issue that I hadn't considered before, and that is that the amplification services is something that may apply more broadly than just in the context in which this regulation is intended to apply. And so my thought would be, if my colleagues agree, is that we take the amplification portion out of this regulation and instead proceed forward with considering a standalone amplification reg and work on that separate from this project. But I don't know what other commissioners' views on that are.
Since I was the instigator of that, I'll chime in first. Thank you. And I really grappled with the application point. I'm grateful that our colleague, Commissioner Wood, raised it in April. It was something I would not have thought of, so I appreciated that information. I'm kind of going to reiterate what I mentioned in both law and policy and what I've thought about since we had that meeting last week. I don't think I have an issue at all with taking this and making it a standalone, so that it is its own, perhaps more clear regulation, how we address it. I had several others that you may be going into here in a moment. First, just looking at if we're treating ways in which we are trying to, a campaign is trying to increase its audience. If we're treating them similarly, and if the ultimate goal is so that the electorate has the information they need to know about what's coming before their eyes, who paid for it, is this organically driven? Very much agree and think it is appropriate for this commission to strongly embrace transparency of it when there are posts and messages getting out there that are not organically driven, but they're presented to the electorate that way. There's other ways in which we do that. I mentioned in law and policy, right now, if a campaign can boost a message, they might not even target it, but they boost it. And how are we going to treat that different than paying for bots to like something? The other campaign, I suppose, could pay bots to dislike something or even generate comments. You may start to see very specific comments happen. Where are we going to make sure we're treating things similarly and still getting that transparency out there? So that was one for me. I raised the point in law and policy. You might have a lawn sign service and you decide I'm going to have a bigger sign, or I'm going to use bright yellow, or whatever. All the strategies are about lawn sign, and half the campaigns don't even think they're helpful. So if we're not requiring some specific more disclosure about something like that, which is to generate more attention and perhaps more audience, are we treating different points under the Act differently? So that was one. And then there's limitations, of course. If we're mentioning that there's amplification that's been used, most of these disclosures are way after the fact. it's not when it's coming before the viewer who may then be shaped by that opinion. Some of these filings are going to be many months later after an election. And so if we are trying to be transparent using the disclosures, that is going to have extremely limited effect, especially when it's so many months later. And I raised some other issues. I think those are ultimately getting to the point of not only should we maybe take this out and have it as a separate regulation, but I think we might need some more deliberative time on some of this, given the questions we're raising. And I hope we will have robust public comment on this one as well. So there's many issues I have with the amplification and what we as an agency are allowed to do, what the disclosures are appropriate to do. And first, I think getting it out and spending a little more time on it might be how we can dive into those more, rather than my listing every one of them. But yeah, thanks.
All right. Other commissioner comments or questions on 18421.5? Commissioner Wood.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis, for your work on this, and Commissioner Baker for all these comments. It's really helpful to play this out. I mean, this was something in my brain for a few years, and so it's nice to kind of air it and see what will work and what makes the most sense in terms of, meeting the public's need to understand when something is, quote unquote, AstroTurf, as opposed to actual grassroots support, for example. And so I really appreciate that. And I would support pulling it out from this and making it a standalone that gets aired more broadly. I think that would be really healthy and productive to do. While we have Mr. Lewis, I just wanted to kind of echo something that was said earlier about specificity, because I worry that we might be being a little too specific in subsections 1 and 2, where we say likes, retweets, or followers, especially because, as Commissioner Baker notes, you can boost to a certain set of followers, right? On, for example, Facebook, and you can also pay. These all, violate I believe they violate the platform's terms, right? To pay for these kind of artificial amplification measures, but you or at least some of the platform's terms, but you can also pay for boosts onto certain pages, right? And that would really be the only time I think that you're able to specifically target an audience in that way. And so we might want to think carefully about the language that we use. I mean, if we're in subsection D, like the big subsection, not the subsections 1 and 2, but in subsection D, we say amplification measures designed to increase the audience size for an online communication. So I wonder if in subsections 1 and 2, we could say for an expenditure made to amplify an online communication, include a notation including information such as, right, the number of likes, retweets, shares, or followers purchased, or something like that, right, to the extent that we're going to go forward with this sort of thing. I did have a couple of, I don't know if we want to talk about this right now, but I did have a couple of responses to Commissioner Baker. I don't know if they're helpful now. I like the yard sign analogy because for me, it draws the distinction that's important, which is a yard sign can't go in front of a house that doesn't exist, right? And here, these boosts and retweets and all these things that come from, the 20% of Twitter users, for example, that are apparently fake, right, seem to come from actual people and who actually don't exist, right? So it gives a fake sense of support that I think is really important for the public to understand, that even though they're seeing it a lot and it looks like it's coming from actual people, it's not. And I think letting them understand that is important. As for the timing, right, this is like a generic problem with disclosures, right? They often come kind of late in the game, though, what we always say in this kind of academic side of things is we rely on the informational intermediaries to get it out there, just like we do with all the other things that we ask them to disclose. So, but I mean, I'd be perfectly happy to talk about timing on this stuff too. So I'll stop for now, but I look forward to really airing this out. I think it's very cool that we're getting a chance to discuss it, and I appreciate everyone putting their brains on it.
Thanks, Commissioner Wood. Other commissioner comments on 18421.5? All right, Commissioner Baker.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation about this. As you have on the next slide, I think it is, if you would go to that one where they're showing how we are proposing disclosing the number of retweets, the number of likes. Were there other alternatives that you were looking at there? I'm trying to play out. It doesn't really tell folks which ones were successfully happened, that you did get the 10,000. You might have only gotten 5. I don't know. Or is it sort of net? I mean, this is what they're paying for, knowing that there can be all kinds of net changes to that. And I'll try to give you an example. There was a time a few years ago, and I actually don't know if this still happens now, where if you liked someone's Facebook profile and then they posted something and maybe they boosted it, it could appear in other folks' feed saying, you know, Catherine Baker likes this post. When you didn't like the post, you liked the originating person's profile. So where I was going with, we're getting very specific here about likes and retweets. Obviously, that was misinformation. It isn't clear to the public that I didn't like that post, whatever it is. And if there were alternatives that you found that could account for, I don't want to say net likes, but just other alternatives you may have looked at here rather than just the number of retweets and likes, or if we have any creative ideas on that.
You know, I think what we sought to do with this portion of the regulation is really just take kind of a first attempt, kind of a first stab for the commission's discussion based on the conversation in April. So no, I think, you know, we have not considered too many different iterations of this. I think I just looked at these sites, as I pictured previously, that literally just offer the ability to purchase these, and thought that was one example of something that might happen.
Thank you, because I was having flashbacks when I saw that and remembered that people would contact me and say, how could you have liked this post? And I look at it, I'm like, I didn't like this post. 2 years ago, I liked the person who was a friend on Facebook. And so maybe that's my rudimentary skills on Facebook, but I think it's important that as we're looking at those things that we're trying to tease some of that out as well, where there's other transparency issues that we may be creating by that disclosure. Thank you.
All right, so let's stick with 18421.5 for a second. I think I am hearing, for purposes of giving, because we are in pre-notice, I want to give some clear direction to staff on this. With respect to 18421.5, I think I'm hearing a consensus and no objections to paragraph D, including subparagraphs 1 and 2, with respect to amplification, being removed from the current draft of 18421.5 and brought back to the commission as a separate standalone reg on amplification. I don't hear anybody objecting to that, number one. So I think, Mr. Lewis, you should proceed according to that, and we can talk about the timing of when amplification comes back as a standalone. The second piece of it is, I know we talked about, I've raised the point, and Commissioner Baker did as well, and so did Commissioner Wilson, about definitions, web application, digital application. I think that it would be a good idea for you to try and craft something, and you're going to have to thread a needle here, because you need to be clear enough so that the regulated community understands what we're talking about here, but also forward-looking enough to capture mechanisms that we may not know of today, but are sure to appear in the future. So I think it's a worthwhile exercise for us to do, and I think it could improve the reg. So I think staff, unless somebody has an objection to that, I think staff should do that. And then in paragraph E, the final feedback I would give is paragraph E, and we talked about this earlier, just clarifying the distinction. What do you mean there when you use the term advertisement, then later on in I, use it in a more specific way? So do commissioners have any other feedback for staff on 18421.5 before we move on?
hypothetical question for Mr. Lewis, and
Please.
I'm not looking for a specific answer, but generally speaking, how many bots would be required, or for there to be a reporting requirement? Do you have any idea? Would it be 1,000, 5,000? I kind of went online to see kind of what bots cost. They're less expensive than I realized. I should probably go get some for myself so I can boost my likes on my Facebook page. But but other than that, do you have any sense for how many bots would require a campaign expenditure report?
I do not have a specific example, Commissioner Wilson, but, on this slide, I did screenshot just one example that I stumbled upon online of how much these tweets and retweets and so on cost. And so I think the general answer would be probably not a lot. Again, I'm not an expert in the practice, but I think it's a lot cheaper than legacy media.
Right. It's my understanding for a few $100 you could buy like 100 likes.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that case, there wouldn't be a reporting requirement.
That's right, as currently written.
So just kind of based on just general math, for less than $100, you could buy 5,000 likes.
Something to that effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's call for public comment on this reg now so that we can keep a clear record. So is there any public comment on the pre-notice language for regulation 18421.5? All right, hearing and seeing none. Mr. Lewis, you have your feedback from the commission on that? Go ahead and proceed, please.
Okay, thank you for that feedback. I'll now go over the proposed amendments to Regulation 18450.4, and these deal with the aforementioned online video ads. So again, to address the problem that I spoke about earlier, what these amendments essentially would do is simply clarify that a video posted on social media that's required to include the disclosures under 84504.3 also has to have those on video and not just on the committee that paid for them's profile or landing page. There's an example pictured here of what that might look like. Sorry, any questions about this regulation before we move on to the...
Any questions from commissioners on 18450.4? All right, go ahead, Mr. Lewis.
All right, finally, proposed new regulation 18450.9 would do really two things. The first, it would require paid posts by influencers on behalf of a committee to tag the committee, as we discussed earlier, so that the viewer can link back to the committee's profile or landing page and see the required disclosure on that profile or landing page. So again, this in the image here, this would be using the tag for the candidate down below, and the viewer can click that and go to his profile or landing page and get the required disclosures. So that's the first change. The second one involves the location of the required disclosures on non-social media sites that are not the committee's website. So for example, if a committee were to pay a blogger, let's see, which one did I mock up here? Let's say this is Sophia Franco's blog. If the committee paid her for a blog post about why people should vote for Lenora Carrington for City Council, that currently 84504.3D says that the disclosure should appear either at the top or the bottom of the web page. But in the case of a blog post like this, let's skip ahead one page here. If we were to put the disclosure on the top or bottom of the page, the web page, let's call it the home page of the blog, it wouldn't really make a lot of practical sense because the viewer would land here on the home page. There might not even be that relevant blog post that needs to feature the disclosure. And so the legal division, again, as mentioned, has advised that what makes more sense is to include the disclosure at the top or the bottom of the individual blog post that actually contains the relevant advertisement. And so those are those two changes. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about this new regulation as well.
All right, any questions for Mr. Lewis? Commissioner Baker?
Thank you, and it is a little bit of a broken record on this one. Going to the point of tagging the, I think a couple slides before, there we go, tagging the person for whom the committee for whom you're trying to support, or whoever paid you. My understanding, I think you've laid this out pretty clearly, is that's because we can't do more. And I think it is good that we're trying to get in this space of when somebody's paid an influencer to do a post like this on Instagram or Twitter or wherever, that you're trying to disclose that. It's extremely imperfect way that is not your fault or anyone's fault. It's where the statute is right now, apparently, because what this may have the inadvertent effect of doing is increasing, traffic to that person's Twitter page for free, or maybe they've factored it into their payment. And I put out there, either to the legislature or however we want to look at this, what if there may be improvements we would like to propose in the future, so that by having this requirement that they use the Twitter handle or Instagram handle, whatever, we are artificially playing a role in that advertisement, which is absolutely not what we should be doing. So I don't object to this now. I just think it really needs to be out there. This is imperfect and really gets us into the space where we're starting to participate in the amplification in some ways. And I wish I could come up with an alternative for not doing that other than maybe we don't have this here and we wait until the legislature changes the rules. But I appreciate it's not you, it's just a very imperfect solution.
All right. Any other comments or questions for Mr. Lewis on this reg? All right. Let's call for public comment then on proposed draft regulations 18450.4, that's video and television advertisement disclosure, and 18450.9, website advertisements, third-party social media advertisements. Do we have any public comment? All right, hearing and seeing none. Mr. Lewis, as always, excellent presentation. And let me just say, I really appreciated in this presentation the use of slides and the visuals. It was really helpful to see how these changes would look in real life, for lack of a better term. So please continue doing that, because that was really, really helpful. This is then slated to come back to us on pre-notice, or come back to us for adoption, in August. Is that right? Okay.
That's correct. And then the amplification matter.
An amplification, Mr. Bainbridge perhaps can advise us on when he thinks, what the timeline is for that to come back as a separate item.
I think it depends on if the commission would like to see. It sounds like from our discussion today, there'll be quite a bit of comment about what comes back. I think we have some general direction, but we might want to get into more specifics. So I would advise that we bring that separate regulation back for pre-notice again in August, when we bring back the rest of these regs for adoption.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And if you were able to have a draft ready in time for the August law and policy meeting, I think that would be helpful too, just so we can gauge stakeholder input, et cetera.
Okay, we'll shoot for that.
Okay. Excellent. Great job, Mr. Lewis.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and proceed to item number 9 at this time. This is In Re Henning Re. We have our General Counsel, Mr. Bainbridge, presenting this item. Mr. Bainbridge.
What we have here on this item is a draft opinion. It comes at the request of the California State Association of Counties and the California School Board Association. Last month, the commission considered a memo drafted by staff regarding this request. That memo laid out how staff has interpreted this regulation and how it's been enforced over the last couple of years. The direction from the last meeting from the commission was to draft an opinion consistent with what the memo said, which was an interpretation of how the law had been interpreted by staff here. The issue here concerns when a communication by a public agency qualifies as a campaign expenditure or contribution, which therefore must be reported under the Act. The two regulations at issue here are substantively the same. The language comes from case law. This is all laid out in greater detail in the memo from last month. I'm just offering this as a recap of what was discussed last month. And so the specific issue that the requesters are asking about is whether the regulation creates a per se prohibition on using certain modes of communications by public agencies. This is 18420.1 that we're talking about. So consistent with what staff has, how staff has interpreted it, the opinion concludes, it's one of these tabs. The opinion concludes that to qualify as a campaign expenditure by a state or local agency under the regulations at issue, a communication must be campaign material that unambiguously urges a particular result in an election. The mode of communication alone does not solely determine whether the communication is a campaign expenditure. Point being that if something is unrelated to a campaign, it doesn't fall within the purposes of the reg or even the Act at all. So that's the gist of what the opinion says. I think in the end, this interpretation, it ensures that reporting of actual campaign activity takes place without being overly inclusive so as to sweep in activity that is unrelated to influencing an election. So that's what we were trying to make clear in this opinion. So I'll let the opinion speak for itself if there's any questions or comments about it. For the commissions, we have the option of revising it, and then if the commission decides to adopt it, either in its current form or with some revisions, it would go into effect immediately.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Do any commissioners have questions or comments from Mr. Bainbridge on the draft opinion? All right. Do we have, hearing and seeing none, do we have any public comment on the draft opinion? And again, that is item number 9, In re Henning Bray opinion. Any public comment? Hearing and seeing none. Well, Mr. Bainbridge, I will say that I thought the opinion was well written. I think this helps clarify an area where I think there may have been some confusion out there. And so I think this is a useful and correct opinion to issue. And so I would move approval.
One additional comment.
Oh, please.
You know, I agree with the chair, but in addition, I think the opinion is consistent with the advice that the general counsel and his staff have provided us over the last year as well.
Exactly. All right.
Seconded your motion if you had moved.
I moved. We have a second. Ms. Linker.
Commissioner Baker,
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas,
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wood. Chair Matich.
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right. Thank you. And again, just to clarify, Mr. Bainbridge, so this opinion is now, it becomes effective immediately, correct?
That's right. It's effective immediately, and there's 30 days if anyone has a concurrence they would like to draft, and then it'll be published on our website, and then also with LexisNexis and Westlaw.
Great. Thank you. All right. Moving right along, go ahead and move to item 10. These are our committee updates. We had 2 committee meetings this month. The first was Law and Policy. Commissioner Baker and I, we heard 2 items. The first was a legislative update from our Ledge Counsel, Ms. Nakano, so appreciated that. And the second was we got a preview of the pre-notice regs on online disclosures from Mr. Lewis, who again did an excellent job for us at Law and Policy. And finally, we talked about the July committee meeting. We will be receiving a report back from staff on behested payments and the progress on behested payment regs. And secondly, we'll be receiving information from staff on the issue of recurring contributions. And this is an issue that we talked about recently where folks were pre-checking the box for recurring contributions. So staff will be reporting on what our regulatory options are for addressing that situation. Commissioner Baker, was there anything you wish to add?
No, thank you. That's a good summary.
And then public outreach and technology, Commissioner Wilson and I met, and Mr. Woodringa and Mr. Crabtree from IT reported back to us on the work that they're doing, the very excellent work, in my view, that they're doing on updating our website to make it more efficient and more accessible to folks, both public and the stakeholder community. And we look forward to them coming back to us again at the next meeting to provide additional updates there. Commissioner Wilson, anything? Did I miss anything?
No. The chair never misses anything, but I would also add that the IT staff, Mr. Crabtree and all of his staff have been very responsive and proactive in responding to our recommendations, so thank you.
All right, moving to item 11, our legislative update. Welcome to the table, our legislative counsel, Ms. Nakano.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. In addition to what's in the legislation report, I've got a few updates that occurred after the agenda was posted. Under priority legislation, AB 236 by Assemblymember Berman, requiring LLCs to submit a statement of members to the SOS if they qualify as a committee or committee sponsor, was ordered to the inactive file by the author on June 3rd. This means that SB 686 by Senator Glazer will be moving forward as the vehicle for the Commission's proposal relating to LLC disclosure. SB 686 passed in the Senate 32-6. The bill had bipartisan support with Senator Ochoa Bogue voting aye, and the bill has been set for hearing in the Assembly Elections Committee on June 30th. There may be amendments forthcoming relating to the look-back period and the monetary threshold that dictates which members of the LLC would be included on the statement, and I will keep the Commission updated on any changes to the bill. Moving on to other priority bills, AB 378, which would remove gendered language in several areas of state law, including in the Political Reform Act, was heard in the Senate Judiciary Committee and passed on consent. AB 1367, which would increase the maximum penalty for egregious personal use of campaign funds, passed in the Assembly 78-0, also, of course, with bipartisan support. The bill will likely be heard in the Senate Elections Committee in mid-July, but has not been officially set for hearing yet. AB 1590, the Assembly Elections Committee bill that includes the Commission's proposal transferring the duty to collect the penalty for failure to pay the annual committee fee from the FPPC to the SOS. That bill passed in the Assembly last month and was referred to the Senate Elections Committee. In the other Commission-related bills section in the legislation report, I won't go over all of the bills in detail, but I wanted to add that both the Senate and Assembly are self-imposing a 12-bill limit per member this year. So because of that, members are starting to cut their bill packages down, and we are seeing that here with some of these Commission-related bills. As noted in the report, AB 975, which included the proposal that would allow electronic filing for statements of economic interest, was ordered to the inactive file. And also an update for AB 40, which relates to slate mailer disclosures, was also ordered to the inactive file by the author. An additional update for other commission-related bills that occurred after my report was posted, SB 752 by Senator Allen relating to disclosure requirements for electronic ads, passed in the Senate 35-0. At the last commission meeting, there were some questions about one of the other commission-related bills, AB 20, which did not move out of the committee, and the questions were about how the bill compares to existing federal law. AB 20 would prohibit business entities, which the PRA defines to include only for-profit entities, from making campaign contributions to candidates for elective office. The prohibition in federal law, on the other hand, prohibits both for-profit and nonprofit corporations from making campaign contributions in federal elections. So the federal prohibition would extend to, for example, professional and trade associations, which are often organized as nonprofit corporations. So federal law is much broader in that sense. The federal prohibition also differs in that it does not apply to LLCs that are organized as partnerships as opposed to corporations. So in that limited sense, federal law is narrower than AB 20. Additionally, 22 other states prohibit corporations from contributing directly to political candidates, but those prohibitions are typically much broader in those states. For example, none of those states appear to allow contributions from nonprofit corporations that are professional or trade associations, and the majority of those states also prohibit contributions from other additional entities, including labor unions. AB 20, as I previously mentioned, did not move out of committee, so it will very likely not be moving forward this year. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Nakano. One question for you. When Mr. Lewis was up here a few minutes ago, we were talking about in the blogger regulation, and Commissioner Baker made the point, which I agree with, that our solution in part is to tag in some instances back to the committee that paid for the advertisement. And part of the reason we're limited to that is because a provision in the Disclose Act, I think that's section 84504.3H. If I'm getting that wrong, Mr. Bainbridge can correct me. But is it your understanding that there may be an opportunity within SB 752 to get the amendment that we need to section 84504.3H and correct that gap?
That's correct. I've spoken with folks who are working on AB or SB 752, and they have expressed a willingness to include that amendment in SB 752. So hopefully we'll be able to get that in before the amendment deadline.
Okay, excellent. And then also, can you tell us when?
Quick question.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, on that, with regard to that amendment, will we get a chance to see a copy of those amendments if they are submitted and adopted?
After
or if we get a copy before they're adopted, should I say?
Before published. Likely that would need to occur within the next week. I can send the commission draft language potentially. Most likely I would not be able to provide language until after it was in print. So that would be at the next commission meeting.
That'd be fine too, just in terms of tracking that particular issue. So thank you.
Yeah, and actually, Commissioner Wilson, I think his comments go to my next question, which was, when do we think that this bill will have amendments in print, and when do we need to really drill down on this before it's heard in the next committee?
I believe that bill is also set for June 30th. The committee typically asks for amendments early in the week prior, so that would be the beginning of next week.
Okay, and so by the July meeting, you would anticipate that we would have language that's gone over the desk that we could then evaluate and decide what position, if any, we want to take on the bill?
That's correct.
Okay, well, I certainly look forward to that in July. Any other questions for Ms. Nakano?
It won't be a very popular one because I don't want you to have to out a legislator who might have given you feedback on this, but can you give us any indication if any of the bills that we find as priority are on the potential chopping block because they are not within a legislator's 12-bill priorities, given that that's the feedback legislators have gotten? Have you gotten any warning signs?
No, I haven't heard any indication that our priority bills would be cut.
Okay. That'll be a good one to be checking on for our next law and policies, to know if we're in that position as well. I have a question about the budget, but I don't know if that, if fits in here, if you're done with your legislative report.
I have a question, Mr. Chair, if I might.
All right, well, why don't we'll come back to the budget.
Yep.
Commissioner Cardenas. All right, and then Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you. Ms. Nakano, good morning. First, I want to state, it occurred to me after last month's meeting that my expression of dismay over a particular piece of inaction from my perspective on the part of the state legislature could be interpreted to have been an indication of displeasure with the substance or the form of Ms. Nakano's report at that particular meeting. That was not my intent in reviewing the video, though. I believe it did have that effect. So I want to apologize to Ms. Nakano. It was not my intent to express, nor did I feel that your report was in any way anything than I have found it to be every month, which is impeccable. So I apologize to you. Now, I do have a question. The related bills, at least thematically, AB 236 and SB 686. So AB 236 no longer exists. I don't know enough about how this process works. So SB 686 now goes to the Assembly. What was AB 236? Was its demise? That's not necessarily an indication that there's no appetite for the substance of SB 686. Is that hopefully correct?
I think that's correct. The authors at some point, we need to reconcile that they had two very similar bills, and I think that's what we have seen happen here.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Commissioner Wilson?
Yes, Mr. Connell, first of all, thank you for your presentation. And you seem to have the ability to be in multiple hearings and floor sessions at the same time. So however you do that, thank you. Now, it's my understanding it was AB 1367 that there was a single bank account provision, and that provision was amended out. Do you have any indication of the rationale for that language being taken out of the bill? Obviously, there wasn't support, but was there any policy basis for that particular revision?
We had some concerns and questions from stakeholders, and we've been in conversations with them to try to flesh out what their concerns are, what the details of their concerns are. So we have been having those conversations. And we are hoping to have something at least similar to the campaign bank account provision put back into the bill, but we haven't quite worked out the details of what that policy would be yet.
Thank you.
Mr. Nakano, can you give us a sense, is that something that you would anticipate being able to update us on in July? On the one bank account or alternatives to that in the bill?
Yes, I think by then we'll have a better idea of the policy and what would be feasible to put back in the bill.
All right, great, appreciate that. Any other questions for Ms. Nakano? Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I just had if there was anything that you can highlight that might have been in the budget, this may be coming later in the budget negotiations, since the budget was just passed, that might affect us and our agency.
I don't have an update on that. I don't know if it's slated for later in the presentation, but currently I don't have that.
Thank you.
All right, great. Any other questions from commissioners for Ms. Nakano on our legislative update? All right, any public comment on this item? Hearing and seeing none. Ms. Nakano, thank you again for your presentation, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
All right, moving to our executive staff reports. Let's go ahead and begin with Chief Brereton and the Enforcement Division.
Good morning again.
Good morning.
Sorry, it takes me a little longer than when I'm at home and I just push the video button. I would just like to point out on page 4 of our report that we provided some feedback that we received questions at the April Commission meeting. And so we provided some responses to those questions regarding the number of AdWatch submissions that we received. over the years, as well as the breakdown of referrals being external versus internal from filing officers. So that information is included in our report. As well as I wanted to note that I did use discretion under Regulation 18360.2 in the streamline regulations to exclude violations for case number 18248, Jeff Hewitt for Assembly District 42, 2016, because the total penalty exceeds the amount that would be paid in a mainline stipulation. And otherwise, it's submitted unless you have questions.
Great. Thank you, Chief Brereton. Any questions for Chief Brereton? All right, that's submitted. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Bainbridge, you're up with the Legal Division report.
Just to add to what's already there, on page 10, where we discuss potential upcoming regulations, obviously as we talked earlier, we'll be breaking off the issue of amplification, so that'll come back for pre-notice in August as opposed to adoption. And then in September, we're planning on adding a regulation project that would provide express permission to agencies, both local and state agencies, to receive forms electronically, such as SEIs and maybe some of the other forms that are filed with the local agencies. For years, the position had been that they needed to be in wet signatures and blue ink. I think if we didn't already know it, the pandemic has certainly shown us that there are ways to sign documents electronically. And so there's nothing in the Act that would prohibit an electronic signature so long as it is a valid signature and it would hold up in court as being under penalty of perjury. We've worked with some of the law enforcement organizations to confirm with them that they find electronic signatures to be valid. And we've had requests from both state and local agencies of being able to have systems and receive their statements with electronic signatures as opposed to requiring people to sign things by hand. So we're going to be putting together a regulation packet that would provide express authority for agencies to receive signatures and forms in electronic format. It'll probably require that they adopt a policy and have certain parameters on how they receive those signatures and have a verification process. We're still working out the details, but just wanted to, I know this has been an issue the Commission has focused on generally, of modernizing and simplifying and making things easier for everybody. So plan to bring that to the Commission in September for pre-notice adoption in November, with the hopes of having it in place in time for next year's filing of FCIs.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Any questions for Mr. Bainbridge? Commissioner Baker?
Thank you for raising the electronic signature issue. So that would only apply to SEI. Would we be possibly looking at other disclosure requirements and having electronic signatures?
Yeah, we're looking at, our original thought was SEIs, but then we realized, well, there's other forms that get filed at the local level. There's behested payment reports. There are some gift to agency reports that get filed just with the local agencies and some state agencies. Actually had a conversation with San Francisco Ethics about this very issue a couple weeks ago, to go back to a theme of the prior in the meeting. So we've been talking with some local agencies, and we're looking to see what forms it would be appropriate to cover, but it won't just be SEIs.
And I actually was thinking of campaign disclosure filings, and if prior to me there were policies about whether you have a wet signature and where and so on. I'm curious if that's being looked at all.
That's not part of this. That's a bigger, more complicated.
We'll start with the simple, the straightforward first, and I would be interested in at some point down the road looking at if those also need to be considered. Those were filings too during a pandemic, of course, and so maybe we could put that on the calendar for in the future, at least revisit that conversation. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Bainbridge? All right, thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Move to our Admin and Technology Division report. Chief of Administration Hahn. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairs and Commissioner. I don't have anything to add. I would like to submit the report as is, unless anyone have questions for me at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Hahn. Any questions for Ms. Hahn and the Admin and Technology Division report? All right, as submitted. Thank you. And last but not least, Executive Director West.
Hello. Yes, I don't have anything special to report personally, but I would like to invite our press person, Jay Wyranga, to give us an update on something he's been working on.
Thank you, Executive Director West. Good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. Jay Wyranga, Communications Director, and I'm pleased to report that we've come to a partnership agreement with Laney College in downtown Oakland, which serves the Central City as well as the East Bay and the surrounding Bay Area. It is the flagship of the 4 Peralta Community College district campuses, a very diverse and multicultural institution. And we've come to a partnership agreement to get one or possibly more students from the Media Communications Department to work on one or more videos if we get more than one student. As part of their class special projects overseen by Professor Steve Schliske, who is the co-chair of the Media Communications Department. Professor Schliske is also well known in the media community in the Bay Area. He's a member of the Bay Area National Association of Television Arts and Sciences, NATAS, more commonly known as the local Emmy organization. So he's very well respected, and I'm glad to be working with him on this project. They'll be getting class credit, and we'll be getting something out of this as well, which is, I think, a win for all of us. So we're planning to work on videos similar to the PSAs that we put together before the last election cycle, as well as potentially working on videos such as, about the FPPC, what we do, who we are, other more generic, maybe evergreen videos on government ethics, campaign finance. They've got a number of ideas, and we'll take what we can, what they will provide. They do excellent work, and some of their students have actually won local Emmys in the Bay Area. So this will start in August, and of course it's a semester project, so the end product will be available in December. And we are looking to keep this as an ongoing thing, semester after semester. So it will hopefully really build our reservoir of videos for the public for information. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, but that's something we've been working on for a number of months. It was paused by the pandemic, of course, but we're getting back to normal, so that's good.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Wyranga. That's great. That's great news. We did the PSA for the last election cycle, and I thought that was good, but I think we can do even more with this additional resource. So good job lining that up for us. I don't know if other commissioners have comments or questions.
That's terrific news. Terrific news, Jay. May I add, is that a Trojan tie by any chance?
Oh, goodness.
No, it's a Jerry Garcia tie, actually.
Almost as good.
Fight on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I don't know. I have to do the 8 clap up here
All right.
for the UCLA folks. All right. Thank you, Mr. Wyranga. Appreciate it. And thank you, Executive Director West.
I want to make sure that Mr. Cardenas knows this is not Dodger blue that I'm wearing. Definitely not Dodger blue.
It's close.
Maybe Golden State Warriors.
It's close enough. It's close enough. Abby, by the way, I queued it up for you. Come on.
I was over here given this thing. I'm a law professor,
right,
so it's not always like top of mind, but I was giving it to you.
All right, there we go. Now we're good.
All right. On to item 13. Commissioner comments for proposed future action. Any commissioners have anything they wish to ask staff to come back at a future meeting and report on? Commissioner Baker?
I don't know that this is future. I wasn't sure if we would get any other from our executive director, a report, but from anyone who might be able to brief on what the budget does, how it affects this agency, and that's one that would be helpful to know. If there's any changes in, trailer language that has authority that affects what we can or can't do, maybe new staff positions or otherwise, I would be welcome knowing it. Knowing that, as I understand it, a budget has been passed by the legislature to meet the deadline, but maybe something hasn't officially been hammered out. And so when it is, or if we have enough meat to the bones about that, I would welcome getting to hear what the budget update would be for us.
All right. Executive Director West, perhaps we can add that to the July, because I know the budget bill, I believe, was passed on the 15th. It's not clear to me all the budget trailer bills have also been finalized and passed. So perhaps July would be a good time for that.
July would be appropriate.
All right. Thank you. Commissioner Wilson?
I wasn't going to comment after Commissioner Baker's comment about Dodger Blue, but I can't resist responding to my Trojan friends. Just want to point out that could be Bruin Blue. And I might also add that UCLA, just take note, was the first Division I school in the country to win 100 NC2A championships across all sports. So thank you.
Excellent point, Commissioner Wilson. Excellent point.
I do not need to have the last word.
I, however, do.
All right. Any other commissioner?
Actually, I did have something that was halfway germane, but but Brother Dotson threw me off. Any indication, Mr. Chair, when those of us south of the Tehachapis may once again be able to visit the lavish confines of our commission office?
That's an excellent question, Commissioner Cardenas. And my understanding is that I know Cal OSHA is meeting today, and we hope to, by the end of the day, have some additional guidance from the state on our reopening plan. There are separate provisions regarding travel of commissioners, and so for folks like yourself who would travel up here, we need to wait for those to be finalized. My best educated guess would be that you would be eligible to return in person next month, consistent with state travel policies if you wished, or you could continue attending by Zoom. The only thing with respect to Zoom attendance that I would update folks on, I know Mr. Bainbridge communicated this previously, the executive order that suspends certain provisions of Bagley-Keene is set to expire in September, I believe. And why that's relevant to Zoom attendance is that after that, the old rules will be back in place, where if you're going to attend remotely, you have to do it from a public place. So wherever you are, Commissioner Cardenas, you would be opening it to the public. So that's the best update I can give on that at this time.
Very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Anything else from commissioners on item 13? All right. If not, I will move to adjourn. Do we have a second?
I can second.
All right. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Wood?
Aye.
Chair Manich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Excellent. Thank you all. We'll see you next month.